Good morning, everyone. Coming to you from the depths of Springfield, New Jersey. We have our third installation of humor, at least Jewish humor, and how we get through the day and how it affects our lives. Just to give you a quick introduction again, I am Stephen Bayer. I am the director of JSurge. With me are Phil Jacobs, who is the editor of JSurge, and also our resident wizard and auto mechanic, Joe Strassler. And JSurge is a trans-denominational. That means we're not affiliated with any movement. We bring Judaism to Jews in all forms. And we ask that if you have anyone who you think might be interested, that you tell them about us, let others know. And we also are, within the next couple of weeks, we're planning on setting up a second website called JSurge Morim, which means teachers, and it's for teachers, educators, parents, and anyone who's interested specifically just in education. So we are going to start the session. If you have a question, you can use the chat on, at least it's on my right, you can chat and ask questions, and we'll answer them as we can. And also there'll be time both during our session and at the end of the session to talk about these programs and this issue and any questions that we may bring up, and we hope we do bring up some issues. So with that, I'm going to ask Phil to begin.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I hope you all had a great Pesach. Thank God it's over with. We can move forward. So after about 40 years of being an editor in Jewish journalism, I just, sometimes humor follows us around and we don't know it at the time that it's funny. Sometimes there's fall on the floor laughing. Sometimes there's some serious irony involved, even though there's some humor involved. So I just wanted to start off by sharing a few of the, I guess, funny things that I ran into over the years. And I guess I want to start by talking to, I once did an interview. All of these are stories that I was involved in writing about. I did an article once on Jerry Falwell and the Jews. Remember Jerry Falwell? Really funny guy, the late Jerry Falwell. He was head of Liberty University and he was outspoken. At the time, he was anti-everything, anti-LGBTQ, some thought he was anti-Semitic. But anyway, in mid-80s, he writes this book, Jerry Falwell and the Jews. And I called his church and asked if I could come down there to a place called, which was a very welcoming name for Jewish people, Lynchburg, Virginia. And I went to BWI Airport and we boarded a plane on an airline that doesn't exist anymore. It was called Henson Airlines. And the plane was about as big as your dining room table. And the seats on the plane were your mother's kitchen dinette chairs with the nails and the red upholstery. You all know what I'm talking about. And we flew into Lynchburg, Virginia, and we get to his church, and he was on the set of something called I think it was called the Old Time Baptist Hour or something like that. And he was under lights and he had makeup on. And the first thing he says to me after he shakes my hand is, "I hope you all don't think I'm one of those pretty boys because I have makeup on." And my inclination was to say, yes, I really thought that you were just a drag queen down here in Lynchburg, Virginia, but I kept my composure and I didn't. But one thing he said that was funny was he said, I was there with a photographer. By the way, getting into the plane, our photographer had to have his equipment weighed and they had to put it in the nose cone of the plane. That's how small this plane was. So Falwell says, "How did you boys get down here? Did you drive or did you fly?" And we said, "Well, we flew." He said, "Did you fly Henson?" And I said, "Yeah, we flew Henson." And he looks at us real deadpan and he says, "Well, I bet you all believe in the Lord now." So anyway, that was a funny moment from Falwell. We do the interview, we go back to the Lynchburg airport and we get back on the same plane. And you're sitting right next to the pilot and the co-pilot, and we hear one of the a gentleman say to the other, "Have you ever flown into Baltimore at night before?" And the other pilot said, "No, I was hoping that you had." And my photographer and I just started saying the Shema, a heck of a lot before but we did get back, and we did kiss the ground when we got home. And again, this stuff kind of follows you around. I was once doing a story on Jewish Civil War reenactors. Believe it or not, there are many, many Jewish men and women who dress up in the blue and gray, and they spend thousands of dollars refighting battles from the Civil War. So at the time, this was in the 1990s, the commander of the Army, the second in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia, reenactors, was a Jewish guy from Baltimore. So I wanted to see him in action. So he was in a battle, quote unquote battle, somewhere in Virginia near Fredericksburg. And so again, I went with the photographer. We drove into Virginia, and he was in full uniform. He was explaining the whole thing to me. And all of a sudden, we had heard that this movie called What About Bob was filming near us. And that movie was starring Richard Dreyfuss and Bill Murray. So all of a sudden, there's a lot of noise going on and not fake gunfire. Richard Dreyfuss walks onto where this reenactment is. And Richard Dreyfuss comes over to the to my friend who I'm interviewing, and he says, "I've always wanted to do this. You have no idea." So they give Richard Dreyfuss a Confederate hat, and they gave him a gun, a rifle, fake rifle. And my friend says to him, "Now listen, because you're new, even though you're a famous actor, you're going to have to die today." So Richard Dreyfuss says, "Oh, I would love to die today." So the guy says, "Okay, so you have to die, keep your eyes closed for 20 minutes, and then when you hear the action die down, you open your eyes again." So Richard Dreyfuss is all excited about this. So my friend, I think his first name was Rex. Rex, he has to die too. So Rex gets shot. He does this whole dramatic thing where he falls on the ground yelling for his mother, "I'm hit, I'm hit." And then he closes his eyes, and then like 20 minutes later, he wakes up, and Richard Dreyfuss has like a piece of straw in his mouth, and he's got his hand on his head like this, and he says, "Rex, not bad, not bad." So those are a couple of the funny things that kind of just approach me. I will say that in the mood of funny, I said the stupidest thing to possibly the most famous person I ever interviewed, and he remembered it, and I'm embarrassed about it, but Elie Wiesel of blessed memory came to the Baltimore area to give a speech, and he's one of my heroes. I'm sure he's one of your heroes. And I'm usually not short of words. So after his speech, he was invited over to somebody's house for a meal before he flew back to New York. I go in, he's sitting there, and I'm with a bunch of other people, and I can't speak. I'm starstruck. I can't speak. And Elie Wiesel says, "So what do you have to say for yourself?" And here's where I wanted to grab my words and stuff them back in my mouth. I said, "I've come to watch you eat." Now, that's the dumbest thing I've ever said to anybody, anywhere. And people were horrified that I said it. He laughed. He was very gracious. 10 years later, I go interview Elie Wiesel in his apartment in New York. So I walk in, I sit down, and in his like near whisper voice, he says, "So have you come to watch me eat again?" So he didn't let it go, but it was kind of a humor moment between the two of us. I guess the last quick example I want to give you before I turn it back over to Steve. There was a story in Detroit when I lived in Detroit about this sukkah hopping, where just tons of kids, and the rabbi would come, and they would go from one sukkah to the other until they got to the rabbi's sukkah. And he would tell stories, and I was there with my notebook taking notes. So we're in there, and all of a sudden, from underneath behind the rabbi, a skunk walks in with like 2 babies following the skunk. It wasn't exactly the Ushpizin. And all the little kids who had come from Candy screamed and ran like crazy to get away. And there's me and the rabbi and the 3 skunks just sitting there. And we froze, and the skunks just looked around and exited the sukkah. So whenever I think about the Ushpizin, I guess I add my other 3 with all due respect with that memory. 3 terrible typos, and then I'll get it back to Steve. The worst typo that I had ever made in a newspaper came from a very unusual place. A lady called me up one day, an elderly lady, and she had a Yiddish accent, and she says to me, "So Phil, do you think it's safe for me to take the cookies out of the freezer now?" And I had no idea what she was talking about. So then she says, "The icebox cookies." So I went back, and I looked on our recipe columns online, and sure enough, we had made the best typo you could possibly make. Instead of put the cookies in the freezer for 1 HR period, we had 1 YR period. So this lady was calling me 6 months later to ask me if it was okay to take the cookies, and I said, "Yes, I think it's okay," and I really apologize for such a terrible thing. So anyway, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Bayer.
I don't know if you saw my comment, Phil, but my sister is a Civil War reenactor.
Really?
Yes, so I rest my case. You are correct. Just so that, you've met us and you know us. Some of you know us and have known us for many years. But Phil and I have known each other for almost 40 years. And we've been through a lot of experiences together. The last one was this past August when we went to El Paso together and visited the migrant camps, both in El Paso and in Juarez. And having been in Juarez with Phil in a car where we were pretty convinced that we weren't going to get out alive, I can tell you that we were both thinking of very inane things to happen. And we used a lot of humor to get through that experience. To be fair, our driver and our guide didn't think there was that much to be afraid of. And the thing is, that much. Bruce, I would tell you that yes, it is the Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression. Yes, Susan, it is the War of Northern Aggression. Susan and I were both raised in the South, so we have a different view of the Civil War. But let me go back over what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks about Jewish humor. There are different forms of Jewish humor. There's just the ha-ha, there's the slapstick. But there's a form of Jewish humor that is very much like a Bugs Bunny cartoon. It's on different levels, it's different humor. Just as Bugs Bunny was a cartoon that appealed to children in slapstick, but also appealed to their parents in its satire. So Jewish humor, true Jewish humor, has a point to it. There's a lot of wordplay of irony and satire. There's a lot of self-deprecation. One of the things that's been pointed out about Jewish humor is that unlike other cultural humors, Jewish humor tends to be self-deprecating, whereas other cultural humors are deprecating towards the outsiders. We are deprecating towards the insiders. And the other point is that it's very, very anti-authoritarian. The running theme of true Jewish humor in this sense is it's always anti-authoritarian. And if you doubt that, then I would suggest that you think about the number of jokes there are about rabbis and cantors, and also about Federation executives, of which there are quite a few. So we treat this type of humor, these jokes, as midrash. And midrash is rabbinic commentary on Torah, where the commentary itself fills in the gaps, creates narratives, or enhances the narratives so that you get sometimes a very different message. One of the best examples of this is the sacrifice of Isaac, where the midrash actually there is a midrash that comes forward and actually states that Isaac was sacrificed, and that he was resurrected at a later time, and there's a reason for this. Not going into that at this point, because that's a really good topic for another session. But another part of Jewish humor is taking control of that which is uncontrollable. We don't control our lives. We have the illusion of that type of control, but humor gives us some ability to control it, or to control our emotions by making fun of it, by pointing out the humor. And so let me tell two more jokes and one more, which give examples of this. I opened up talking 2 weeks ago with the rabbi and the cantor and the president of the synagogue, who were taken captive by terrorists who intended to kill all three of them. And they give each one a last request. And for those of you who are here, see if I tell this story any better than I did 2 weeks ago. The rabbi says, I've got this sermon, it's very long and I've never been able to give it, but I want to give it before I die. So that is my last request. And the cantor says, I've got this Kol Nidre I've never done. It takes a very long time, but it is the Kol Nidre I always wanted to do. That would be my last request. And the president's request is, shoot me first. Second, how many Zionists does it take to change a light bulb? Well, 4. 1 to donate the light bulb, 1 to screw it in, 1 to declare that the entire Jewish people stand behind this, and 1 to declare that the entirety of Judaism is being destroyed by this action. So let me tell you a third joke, which is a Hasidic Jew leaves his small town in Poland, and he comes to London, and he immediately discards everything that was Jewish. He goes to law school. He marries into a very prestigious and assimilated Jewish family. So one day he gets a telegram that his elderly father is coming for a visit. Now the man is thrown into a panic, and he goes to the port to meet his father, and he says, Papa, if you show up at my house in your long coat and your head covering and your payas, it will destroy me and everything I've built here. So you must follow anything I do and do everything I ask. And the father agrees. So the man takes his father to the finest tailor in London and buys him a beautiful shirt, and the man looks too Jewish. So then he takes him to the barber. Now he's bought him a shirt, he's bought him a suit, he takes him to the barber where the beard is quickly shaved off. And the old father is starting to look more and more like a true British gentleman. But there's still one problem, the payas, the side curls around his ears. So, Papa, we're going to have to cut them off. And the old man says nothing. So the barber cuts off 1 payas. There's no reaction from the old man. But when the barber starts to cut the second one, tears start streaming down the old man's face. And his son is mortified. Papa, I'm so sorry. I really, why are you crying, Papa? Please don't cry. Please don't cry. What's the matter? His father looks at him and says, I'm crying because we lost India. I'll hand it back. I'll hand it back to Phil.
Oy, I don't know how do you follow that up? Okay, so there were also some assignments there where I came near throwing up. I'll just be very blunt about it. And there's nothing funny about throwing up, but maybe these are. So in the lower eastern shore of Maryland, believe it or not, there's a kosher slaughtering plant. And it's run by Hasidim who come in from Brooklyn on Sundays, and they work until Thursday. And it's right next to the Purdue chicken processing plant, by the way. So I decided to bring my wife with me. They did not answer any phone calls. I was just going to knock on the door and see if they would let me do an interview with them. So we get down there, and there are these trailers all in like a circle. And one of them happened to be a mikveh. One of them happened to be a study hall, a base medrash, sleeping quarters. So I ring the doorbell, and this guy comes in a white, it was once a white lab coat with a white helmet, but it's covered in chicken blood. And he speaks very little English, and I told him I was from the Jewish Times, and he said, sure, why don't you come on in and you can see what we do here. So I took about 2 steps and saw what they did there, and I had to bend over and get my blood to my brain. And that's as close as I got to that story. I did the rest of the interview from the outside. Very similarly, on a different vein, I was doing a story on the Maryland Shock Trauma Unit, and they've got this phone in shock trauma that if that phone rings, it means that somebody's coming in, and they have an hour to try and save that person. I prayed to the gods in high heaven that that phone would not ring while I was covering this story. And sure enough, the phone rang, and a helicopter came a little bit later, and we were on the top floor of University of Maryland Hospital. And once again, they had to work on me a little bit to get me back into the story, because again, I was going to pass out. But I guess the best story I have in this area was, again, with my notebook, I'm on one of these bay liners in Baltimore, and in the 1980s, there was a kosher firm here in Baltimore that did both kosher catering and non-kosher catering. So you kind of know where this is going. I'm on this bay liner, it's a party boat ostensibly, and people are eating and having fun, and most of them are very frum people, Orthodox men, you know, wearing their black hats, and women with everything covered. And then all of a sudden, there's an announcement over the microphone: everybody stop eating. So it turns out that the non-kosher staff of the kosher caterer was supervising this voyage, and people, they didn't stop eating at all. They just kept shoving it into their faces, with me taking pictures and writing things down. And we ended up calling that the Voyage of the Damned. But it was funny at the time. Trust me, it was funny. Sometimes there's stories that may seem to have a little bit of humor to them. They're just, you know, you gotta smile, but you're smiling maybe in sadness. And there's three of them that I related to that came out of my career. In 1982, when the AIDS crisis was everywhere, I got a phone call from the president of our local conservative synagogue, who said there's a number of Jewish men who were getting out of marriages to women, or who were married at one time to women. And they had an organization, it was called GAMA, the Gay Married Men's Association. So they invited me they wanted to be interviewed. So this is before cell phones, and this is before email and all of that. So I went to this apartment in Baltimore City, and there were 8 men sitting there. 3 of the 8 men had grocery bags over their heads with slits in the grocery bags for their eyes. And I asked, please take that off. I mean, you know, your name, your identities aren't going to be disclosed in any way, shape, or form. And they insisted, no, you know who we are. Please don't, please, you know, we'd rather keep the grocery bag on. So if you think it's tough keeping these masks on, by the way, that we're using to go outside in this day, can you imagine a 3-hour interview with a grocery bag on your head? So we did try to get a little humor out of that, but they were talking about very difficult situations, and where they had to leave their families because of you know, they came to terms with their own sexuality. And one of the men that I interviewed kept using the same language over and over again. He used the word really a lot. And when the story came out, I changed everybody's identity. If they were a businessman, I turned them into a doctor. And if they were a doctor, I turned them into a real estate agent. But I got a call from a daughter of one of these men who said, the guy that you talk about as Michael, that's my dad. And I said, well, I'm not going to tell you who's who. But she was absolutely right. And it was because during the interview, he told a little joke about how he was feeling about life. And his entire family knew that joke. So it was kind of a humorous but not humorous moment that shows up in a writer's career, a journalist's career. I guess the other one is a much more controversial story that came out. I don't think it's so funny, but I guess the results of it, how it came together, might be a little bit humorous. In Baltimore, we had at one time a very, very prolific Holocaust survivor who spoke to everybody. She was the one who would be sent to the Christian school. She would be the one to speak to museums, Holocaust memorials. She really had an amazing way of presenting herself. She was an Auschwitz survivor. So during her tenure as one of these lead speakers, some of the other Holocaust survivors approached us and said that this particular person was embellishing her story of the Holocaust. And we were like, well, how can you embellish anything having to do with the Holocaust? And so it turned out that we hired a historian. A historian looked and checked all the boxes for us, but there was one box that went unchecked. This particular Holocaust survivor told us that she was married, and she and her husband both went into Auschwitz, and she never saw her husband again. And the other survivor said to us, that's not true, that her other husband might be alive somewhere. So you don't have to be a great investigative journalist anymore. I typed in her husband's name on Google, as simple as that, and about 10 of these names came up all over North America. And the second one I called was her husband. And he laughed. He thought it was really funny. And he said, no, tell her I'm still alive and I'm doing well. So I called the survivor back and I said, why did you have to tell us the story? Why weren't you truthful about this? And her answer to me was, the guy who I had married went into the concentration camp and he came out and he was a different person. He was abusive. So the boy I married was dead to me. So, I mean, I'm not allowed to judge that as a reporter, but, you know, I said, that's pretty much not acceptable. And, you know, her ex thought it was very funny. So where this leads to is, thankfully, I'm friendly with Deborah Lipstadt, the scholar on Holocaust denial at Emory University. And I called her and I laid it all out there for her. And she said, you have to run the article. You have to run the article because even if the revisionists pick this up and put it out there, the truth has to be told. So, of course, we went ahead and we did the article and we explained how funny the surviving husband thought all of this was, but we were really hit and criticized for going ahead and picking on a Holocaust survivor. But still, Deborah Lipstadt, we had Deborah Lipstadt to lean on. So I know that's not really funny, but those are two examples where you step back because it's different. You don't walk into a room every day and see three men with paper bags on their heads and know how to react. You don't catch a Holocaust survivor in an embellishment, but that's what happened here. And punchline with the survivor, she was taken off the Speakers Bureau list because of the embellishments. Steve.
So we're going to segue back into the Holocaust because Phil's last point is actually a very poignant one. Is there humor in the Holocaust? And we've been talking, last week we spoke a bit about Mel Brooks and about the producers and about how Holocaust, what kind of humor is Holocaust humor? Is it really too early or not? So I'd like to read two quotes about the Holocaust, especially since Tuesday is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And the question of humor, especially now, is timely because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and it is Yom HaShoah this week. And not to compare the two, but they are both stresses and stressors in our lives. The first quote is from one of my teachers named Menachem Kellner. The questions ultimately posed by the Holocaust are theological questions. It is the existence of God which is finally questioned, not only the goodness of God. And the second is from an Alexander Donat. Dr. Isaac Schipper, the Polish Jewish historian, who was my closest neighbor in the potato peeling brigade at the concentration camp, to him I owe an insight which has haunted me every day since my stay there. Quote, "There is no such thing as historical truth," he would say with his sad smile, when we dreamed about how after the war, the survivors of the camps would tell the world the whole truth. There is just interpretation. It depends on who writes the history of our time. Should they write the story of this war, our destruction will, should they win the destruction of the war, the Nazis will write the story that it was one of the most glorious exploits in world history. But if we write the story, we will have the thankless task of proving to a disbelieving world what we really are. Are we Abel, the murdered brother? It's very sad quotes, but very instructive as well. Because if you remember, one of the issues of Jewish humor is that it's anti-authoritarian. And I said, think about how many jokes there are about rabbis and cantors and federation presidents. But think of how many jokes there are about God. So for instance, a man brings some very fine material to a tailor and asks him to make a pair of pants. So he comes back a week later and the pants are not ready. 2 weeks, the pants are not ready. Finally, after 6 weeks, the pants are ready. The man tries them on and they fit perfectly. Nonetheless, when it comes time to pay, he can't resist jibing at the tailor. You know, he says, it took God just 6 days to make the entire world, and it took you 6 weeks to make just one pair of pants. Ah, the tailor says, but look at that pair of pants and look at the world. And then another, a man visits a zoo and is taken to a lion's cage. He witnesses there the literal fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy, a lion and a calf in a cage together. Amazed, he calls over the zoo attendant. He says, how long have you had a lion and a calf together in a cage? Well, we've done it a year. Well, how does it work? Well, it's easy. Every morning we put in a new calf. We take control of the uncontrollable. And it's very anti-authoritarian. How much more anti-authoritarian can you be when you take on God? And how can we do this? Well, we do it for two reasons. One, our tradition is that we are a covenanted people. And a covenant is just a very fancy term for a contract. We have a contract, and that contract specifies what we have to do and what God has to do. And when God does not fulfill God's requirements based on our needs, we have the right to take God to task. And that is what this humor does. Now, what's important also to recognize is the second reason. This discussion of humor concerning the Holocaust, just the fact that we're having a discussion of humor, just that fact alone shows that we are in some way dealing with the issue. And it may be another 30 years before we deal with the issue enough that we are actually a little bit more comfortable with it. But that said, we are dealing with it. And in that vein, Mel Brooks's humor was extremely important because it started a discussion. Now, I can tell you that these are discussions and this is humor that does not exist in the more traditional community. When I was in yeshiva, there were no jokes about the Holocaust. and there was nothing humorous about the Holocaust. But there was a reason for it. And the reason was that in the very traditional community, they know why the Holocaust happened. It happened because of covenantal violations by us. In other words, in the Haredi community and the very traditional community, we were being punished. And they have those answers. They don't need to take control of an uncontrollable situation because they do control it. They have the answers. Now, we have answers, but we don't know what answer is correct, or the answers are not satisfactory. And remember, humor gives us a little bit of control. So with that, the question becomes, when that old woman looks up to heaven after her grandson has been brought back from the waves, and she turns to God and says, he had a hat. In vain, in light of everything we've said about the Holocaust and our response to it, that statement is not only humorous, but it is a statement of rebellion against our traditional view of God. I'm going to hand it back to Phil.
Wow, thank you. Yasher Koach, Rabbi. I showed my...
Phil, please call me by my first name, the.
Okay, the. You triggered in me a couple of thoughts. I showed two movies to my 11th grade students at Beth Tefillah who were studying the Holocaust. And one of them was the recently screened film, Jojo Rabbit. And I don't know if all of you are familiar with that, but it's a film where a young boy who is a kind of a weaker member of the Hitler Youth, his fantasy friend, his invisible fantasy friend is Hitler. And his mother, meanwhile, is a resistance fighter in a quiet way. And they are housing a young Jewish woman who, so the boy is torn between, does he turn the girl in and his dedication to his mom? And there are some very, very funny light parts of the film. So first I showed this film to my 11th grade two classes, both of them kind of honors level classes. And then I wanted to see how they would react to a very different film called Life is Beautiful. And this was a Holocaust film that came out several years ago. I think it won Best Actor at the Academy Awards. And this was a film where a father in Italy, a Jewish father in Italy, tells his son as they're taken away that that all of this is a game. All of this is a game, and the game is to win a tank if they are to survive the Holocaust. And it's interesting that my children, my kids, had less of a. Hold on one second. I have a grandson running in here. Take this to your email.
Can you turn it on?
And the.
Can you turn it on?
Hold on. So the kids had difficulty with the second film is what I'm trying to say. In the interviews that I've done with survivors who have watched both movies, they like Jojo Rabbit, and more than they didn't like the 10 or so I interviewed. But way back when the producers came out the second time around, not with Zero Mostel and Gene Wilder, but the second one, we did a group of interviews as well with survivors. And their bottom line was, as long as the Holocaust wasn't being made fun of, it was okay to make fun of Hitler. And that's kind of the mantra I've gone by since. I've even seen Mel Brooks say that. Steve and I were talking just yesterday about who's replacing these comedians who have a connection to World War II and the Holocaust, like Mel Brooks, and Carl Reiner, and many of the others that we know from. And I asked my millennial daughter and her husband what their take would be on that. And they said that younger comedians are talking a lot less now about what's going on in their lives in terms of anti-Semitism, but they're using Judaism as a backdrop in their comedy. So so they're taking that from the past. They're borrowing that from the era of Joan Rivers and Buddy Hackett and Jackie Mason even. And I think I told you last week a couple examples of the humor are kind of, for me, they were difficult to take. Judy Gold, who was a comedian in her late 40s, who I've actually written about, said that just in stand-up, she said, if she was back at Auschwitz, she often wonders when she was standing in line, if she had been standing in line naked to go to the gas chambers, would she have looked around and tucked her stomach in? Which, she thought was funny. And then the other one was Sarah Silverman, whose sister, by the way, is a rabbi, who just came out and said, my Nana was in one of the better concentration camps. Instead of a number tattooed on her wrist, she had the words bedazzled. So again, they always follow with too soon. And I'm wondering how we're going to see comedy come out of the coronavirus pandemic. Is it too soon or not? So anyway, there you have it. Oh, I had to tell you one other thing. The greatest, the best save I ever made at the Baltimore Jewish Times had nothing to do with editorial. I was looking at pages going out the door, and this was around Rosh Hashanah, and there was a full-page ad of this scrumptious-looking lobster, and the lobster had some kind of butter sauce all over it. And on top of the lobster with butter sauce, in Hebrew, it said Lashana Tova. So I said, even that is too much for the Baltimore Jewish Times. So we pulled it, and the ad salesman is like, why? Why is it such a... Don't put that in, trust me. So, Steve. Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay,
So
take it away.
when Phil asks about the pandemic, and by the way, in about 3 minutes, we're going to open it up for questions. And, but until those 3 minutes come, I'm positive everyone's been on the internet quite a bit. So you know that the first week in April, the first 8 days in April, from now on are going to be an American civil holiday because it is the miracle of the toilet paper. People had enough toilet paper to last for one night, and yet miraculously, it lasted for 8 days. That's an example of the humor we're seeing. The Jewish humor we're seeing, or at least the humor from the Jewish community, is talking about the plagues and the Seder. I mean, what better way to have a pandemic than to have it right around Passover? And I cannot tell you the number of jokes I have seen about grandparents on Zoom or not on Zoom. One of the 4 questions, the first question is, how do you unmute yourself on Zoom? And the miracle of the grandparents being able to be on Zoom at all. There's been a tremendous amount of humor. It's been helped along by TV personalities, by just so many people telling so many jokes on social media that we have been able to see at least the humorous side in our community. There are other communities where there is no humor because they are much more affected by the pandemic. We seem to be somewhat luckier, if we can use that word, because we have the ability to self-quarantine.
My daughter, by the way, Steve,
Yeah.
put out a table with Elijah's cup on it and some latex gloves so that when we opened up the door for Elijah, you know, he would have been okay. He had a little mask out there.
About getting the wine through the mask was not so easy. So these are the things that we are talking about, and these are the things that are affecting us at this time. I come back to something I said last week about Nachman of Bratslav, the Hasidic Rebbe, whose response to the pogroms was, Gewalt Jews, do not despair. Gewalt Jews, do not despair. And that is the cry of one person, that it is forbidden to despair. But one of the ways in which we fight despair is by finding any type of humor that we can, any type of thing that we can laugh at, any type of thing that we can smile, even as if, as Phil says, it's a sad smile, but it's still a smile. It's a recognition of the irony or of just the ridiculousness and the absurdity of life as we are living it today. So with that, before we end, we have time for questions. I'd like to respond to something that Gil said, which is that the joke of the hat is similar to Buber's Ayu relationship that we enjoy, that other religions don't. And my response to that was, I think they're complementary, yes. The fact that the woman could turn to God and actually say he had a hat, just think about all of the emotions that brings up in God. You know, you're not happy with whatever I'm doing, or I listen to you and you want more. But that's the relationship we create with God post-Holocaust especially, which is perhaps we don't understand everything that goes on. In fact, we don't understand everything that goes on. And that doesn't in any way intimidate us. We are going to ask these questions and demand answers, or at least let you know how dissatisfied we are. That is a unique relationship that we share with our God that other religious traditions do not. So, and as far as when we talked about Hogan's Heroes and we talked about Werner Klemperer, whose father, by the way, was a great conductor, and how John Banner and also Robert Clary were all Holocaust survivors, and that there was a tremendous amount of stress in playing these parts. And I mentioned just now that I remembered Robert Clary's interview in TV Guide. I was only 2.5 months old at the time, but I remember I was very precocious and I read that Clary's anger at the Nazis and the French in World War II was palpable. And he took the job both because it was a job, but more because he felt that he could help show just how horrible things were. And he at least got the last word in the TV show, where he didn't get it in the field itself. Interesting. The question about, is American Jewish humor similar to Israeli humor? No, it's not. And in fact, there isn't a tremendous amount of Israeli humor that is coming out. I mean, there are a lot of jokes about the stress of the war, of the wars that they've been in. I mean, one joke that I remember a lot is that Moshe Dayan had all of these he had all of these tanks and things and all of this money, but he couldn't find it because he had put it in his wife's name. Or lots of jokes about the inefficiency of the Arab armies, and lots of very, very maudlin jokes about exactly what life in Israel is like. But Jewish humor as we know it today is much more Ashkenazic, because most of us are products of Ashkenaz. And Israel is not an Ashkenazic state. You know what? If you raise your hands, Joe will recognize you and you can actually ask the question. Do you want to ask your question? Yeah, and yes, there are Israeli comedies that come out, but the paucity of Israeli comedies in Israel, or the nature of the Israeli comedies in Israel, is very different from American Jewish humor, which is Ashkenazic. Oh, Gil, how do you raise your hand? If you, let's see. Oh,
I got it. I think I got it. I think I figured it out.
Okay. Gil, don't jump. Don't jump.
Yes, I'm here in lovely San Francisco. I'm actually in Kentucky. Actually, there are two things I wanted to discuss, if possible. One was something I learned about a Jewish joke recently, which I find very interesting. If I may, I'm a research scientist, and I have a technician who happens to be Native American. So rather than just telling her the joke, I asked if this joke would be offensive to Native Americans. And for those of you who don't know the joke, it's about the Jewish man who marries a Native American woman, and his father is very distraught, and they don't speak for several years. And then the son finally calls up the father and says, "Dad, I want to make amends. We had a baby, and we gave her a Jewish name. We called her Whitefish." Now, I asked my technician, "Is that offensive?" And she said, "It's not offensive. It just doesn't make any sense. Why would they name it Whitefish? Is something in the woman's family? Did they have a white fish or something?" Which taught me more about Native American culture than it did about Jewish humor. That, and the other thing is, could we discuss the funny you don't look Jewish, which I find fascinating because Jews seem to find that hysterical, and not a single Gentile that I've ever told it to thinks it's funny at all.
Gil, can you tell the joke? Because there are 2 or 3 jokes I can think of right now that have that punchline. So which joke are you referring to? Gil, we can't hear you.
There we go. Okay, I'm on. I'm back on. This is complicated. I have to do a minion tomorrow night for my father's yard site, so I have to learn how to do this. Joke about the Jewish businessman who goes to Japan, and it's a Friday night, and he has to find a shul, so the concierge sends him down the street to this local shul where all these Japanese Jews are praying in Hebrew, but with Japanese accents, and it's extremely offensive to Asians because of the way you do tell the joke. And he's sort of fascinated by this, and at the end, at the oneg, they're all talking to him, and each one is asking him, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? Because they're all Japanese, and he's not. And finally, he's, "Of course I'm Jewish. My name is Morris Schwartz. I'm from New York. Of course I'm Jewish." And the guy goes, "Funny, you don't look Jewish."
Okay. All right. I'm when you tell a Jew a joke, he always tells you another joke that goes with it and tells you other things. So the joke I was thinking of, and I think they're both related, is that a man goes into a Chinese restaurant, and I know that this is on PC, and I do not apologize for it because we're dealing with Jewish humor. But he goes into a Chinese restaurant and he orders in Yiddish. And in Yiddish, he is told, the Chinese waiter answers him in perfect Yiddish and everything. So as the man is leaving, he goes to the owner of the restaurant and he says, "How come he knows Yiddish so well?" And the owner says, "Shh, don't say anything. He thinks it's English." So in both cases, I would just, off of the top of my head, my answer would be, this is just a very, it's a comment on assimilation. And it's almost a satirical comment on assimilation, which is in the restaurant one, you have another cultural group, another immigrant group trying to fit in, and we take advantage of that to help us fit in with them. In Gil's joke, which is, it's how Judaism is, Jews tend to be, if you saw the movie Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck and John Garfield, you'll see that it's a comment, it's a satirical comment on assimilation as well. How an American Jew who can't be convinced, who can't be shown anything other than being an American Jew or very Jewish, goes to a foreign land where he's not considered Jewish anymore. So this is social commentary off the top of my head. Phil, do you have,
Yeah, I mean, I think we take social commentary to to the nth degree, and we read inside jokes that seem obvious and kind of dissect them, perhaps more. But I think there's so much truth to the inside joke that most of us are either expected or do know. I mean, you get back to you don't look Jewish. My late aunt, taught her Mina bird how to say, you don't look Jewish. So when people would come in, house cleaners or delivery people, they would hear somebody say to them, you don't look Jewish. And it was really funny. And the person looked at us like, why would you teach a bird to say that instead of, Polly wants a cracker? But afterwards, we would all get together and high five each other. And, just see the look on that guy's face when the Mina bird said, you don't look Jewish. So this is who we are. And we're proud of it.
and it's not only that we're proud of it, it's one of our major strengths, that our ability to find humor, not necessarily to laugh, but to find humor is definitely a strength that we have. And I hope as we go forward that we can use this humor in productive ways and show others as well, because by our strength, we can keep other people strong as well, not only in the model, but also in the support that we can give. So we thank you. Just to let you know also that we are talking about other, we're going to be setting up hopefully other Zoom classes within the next several weeks. If anyone has a suggestion of what they would like to hear, and also we are available individually, both Phil and I are available individually through the website or through our emails. If there's any question you have or anything you need and we can help you, I'm not going to answer the Fiddler on the Roof because I have a feeling we might be doing Fiddler on the Roof in the future. So Broadway comes to Judaism perhaps, but thank you very much. To tell you again, our website is jsurge.org, and we thank you very much for tuning in.